One of them randomly turned to me and said, "The color of your skin makes you want to vomit." And the other one sort of did this and, put his hand up to his mouth and made some like vomiting, retching noises. And all I remember thinking at the time was like, oh my God, this is terrible. Like, I've clearly made these people feel so unwell, and so terrible that they feel the need to say this. I feel awful. And I was panicking, right?
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Welcome to Represented, the podcast. I'm Aniki Shuru, racial equity coach for online business owners who want to be intentionally inclusive by building a business that is racially equitable. I created this podcast to normalize a conversation around racial inclusion so that fear is no longer the barrier that gets in the way of doing this work. This isn't about perfection, it's about progress. Whether you're taking your first steps or you're well-versed in the journey towards racial equity, this space is for you. So welcome home, friend. Let's get started.
From coast to coast, around the globe, we are represented.
The idea of having a podcast is something that I had sat on for quite a few years. And one of the things that kind of got got me excited was when I had a conversation with one of my past clients. Her name is Susan Ryok. She's an incredible UX copywriter. And she said, you know what, Annie, I would really, really love it if you created something where I could connect with your network of other women of color. I'd love to hear their stories of race, what they've experienced, how they're living their life now, their accomplishments that they have. And I would, in particular, just love to hear you having a conversation with them. And looking back now, especially after having this conversation that I've just finished having with Khayshie, I just feel so blessed to reach out to these incredible women, in particular women of color, and having conversations. They are just so full of wisdom and knowledge. And in particular with Khayshie, she just has a way of sharing a story and using analogies that make so much sense. I feel after this conversation that we've had, I'm a little bit more wiser. I feel like I have more knowledge. And I need to go back, listen to this conversation, and just take away some more nuggets because there is a lot. This is a conversation you will listen to and potentially come back again. And it is with most of the episodes that I do. And with this one, it was very much centered around leadership in corporate spaces. Now, don't turn away because I know you're probably an online business owner and you're going like, oh, this one doesn't have anything to do with me. It does, because it's talking about how we can take the concept or the whole idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion and make it such that we are living it. And it's not just something that is separate. How can we have more impact? How can we take action? And it is hearing this work over and over again and hearing it from different people that it begins to sink in. And so let me share a little bit about who Khayshie is and then over to our conversation. Khayshie Tilak Ramesh is an award-winning advocate, lawyer, and educator, redefining workplaces as powerful sites for social change. With a decade of leadership across government, legal, and community sectors, Khayshie brings lived experience and strategic insight to drive systemic and behavioral change. As the former Multicultural Youth Commissioner of Victoria and a global representative for Australia's gender equality priorities at the United Nations, Khayshie is a sought-after thought leader, speaker, and commentator in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Known for making the invisible visible, she inspires change by connecting hearts, minds, and systems. Khayshie is the founder of her own consultancy where she partners with impact-minded organizations to embed inclusive mindsets, cultures, and practices. Khayshie also serves as Vice President and Deputy Chair of YWCA Australia and as non-executive director for both the Iceberg Foundation and the Gender Equity Victoria. Without further ado, here is Khayshie. Hey, hey, welcome back to another episode of Represented Podcast. I have a very special guest with me today. Khayshie, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited.
Now, we've already caught up. We had a conversation yesterday and we just unpacked so many things. This was a conversation that was supposed to take half an hour at the most, but we were pushing to an hour, I think, or even over, because we just had so much to share with one another. And as I was preparing for today and I was reading through your bio, a couple of things struck me. Firstly, you are so highly accomplished. It was just
Thank you.
thing after thing after thing. I was like, wow, she is so highly accomplished. And I especially loved the bit in your bio that says, that you're known for making the invisible visible, that you inspire change by connecting hearts, minds, and systems. And I thought that might be a good place for us to begin. How do you make the invisible visible, and what is it that it is in reference to?
Yeah, great question. I love that this automatically just moves straight into the depths of it. And yeah, I agree. I feel like our conversation yesterday was one where we had to consciously cut ourselves off to make sure
Yeah.
it was content for the podcast, which is always nice.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I feel like, reflecting on my journey and thank you for for saying all those very lovely things. I've always kind of struggled when it comes to describing what I do. I think that's why I landed on something
Yeah.
quite broad. But I realized that, throughout my career, I've been in, that legal space, I've been in the conflict resolution space, I've been in government, community, all these different places. And it almost feels like in the beginning, I used to think that I was quite fickle because often you get people being like, Keishi, just pick one, like pick a career or like pick a job. But I'd often find that I'd gravitate towards these positions that had almost a similar element when you look back. I feel like everything makes sense when you look back, but you
Mm,
don't quite understand it at the time.
yeah.
And I realized that all of these roles that I was gravitating towards were all about bridging understanding. So, how do we take these really big, complex systems? So, say, for example, the legal system, and how do we explain that to somebody who's going through potentially the worst day of their life? So I've often been, say, in like a duty lawyering situation when I was volunteering at uni, where I'd work with a lot of women predominantly who were facing family violence. And you'd get these, these big lawyers, and they were so intimidating, but lovely, lovely people. But for someone on their first day in court, quite intimidating, where, they had all this knowledge, they were so book smart, so well studied, but they just couldn't understand that the way they were explaining things was quite overwhelming for somebody who's new to this concept, right? So you'd have these lawyers who, like, they have quite a big frame, they're standing in the only exit, the only door, and they're talking to this woman who's experienced violence, saying, hey, you need to make a decision because, we're seeing multiple clients, you need to say something. And then I would sit there as a student, and, originally I used to have a lot of imposter syndrome around doing law because it was never something I wanted to do. But it was only in those moments where I realized that it was more important that I understood how to explain something to someone and meet them where they were, that was more important than actually knowing, every single piece around the legal content. And I think that sort of realization and working in those sort of community spaces gave me a real passion for how do we make these really big, complex systems that we're all bound by, which I found wild that, we're so bound by these laws, but a lot of us don't understand them. How do we translate some of these really big things into digestible and accessible parts so that people can begin to come along that journey?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more, especially when it comes to anything to do with law. I think people hear law and they're just like, okay, I'm not speaking. I'm gonna let somebody who is well trained in this area who is qualified to explain it to me in terms and language that I can understand. And so there is an openness and a way in which how the way it's written, the way your bio is written, that allows people to take a step closer to you and feel like they will be held. There's a safety to it. And it's not often that I read bios that you feel that, but with yours, there was a safety element that came into that, which brings me to the next thing, which was as I've been just doing more understanding of your work and what you do and the incredible difference that you're making. What stood out for me, Khayshie, is the fact that leadership is something that has been it's followed you everywhere, whether you were in uni, you've been awarded, best student. You've just had award after award. You are in a number of very, I guess, decision-making roles as well with different organizations. Is it something that you set out to do deliberately in terms of being in leadership and the excellence that you operate under? Growing up as a kid, was it something you saw maybe from your parents or relatives or close family friends? What is it that got you to this point where it's just leadership roles and influence and decision making?
That's a great question. I feel like you're gonna have to put like a filter so I'm not blushing as much on the camera. No, fantastic question, and probably one that I haven't answered in a while. I think that leadership to me was something that I didn't really set out for, I think, in the outset. In terms of my background, like I grew up in a regional area of Bendigo and I adore my hometown. It's a fantastic place with very lovely people. And I think growing up, one thing that I did notice, and I only really, I think, came to terms to a bit later in life, was the lack of cultural diversity that was visible at the time, right? So I had many friends, all very lovely people, but very few who could relate to the same experiences that I was having.
Yeah.
And while there were some fantastic opportunities, the amount of, I guess, leadership who was visibly culturally diverse was quite scarce. There were some here and there, predominantly men, actually, at the time.
Yeah.
Not very many young women, not very many young women of color, not very many young women of color with a regional context. So I did find that I was sitting at what I now know is, this concept of intersectionality, but I
Yes.
was sitting at this sort of intersection of so many different identities where, from a leadership perspective, I didn't often see people who looked like me in leadership, but more so importantly than looked like me, people who could represent the perspectives and I guess the understandings and experiences that I'd had at the time. So what's quite ironic about the leadership side is that from a young age, I find that, a lot of South Asian families push really hard. My parents, they push to an extent. I feel like they often made peace with, pushing not the way that I'll respond. My sister responded very well to that. I did not respond to that well. She's a doctor now, go figure. So in terms of, our upbringing, I found that, my parents, when I moved into leadership in a lot of these roles early on, I often had the opposite experience where they would say, like, are you sure you want to do this? Because we've been told to keep our heads down. The
Hmm.
way to make it is to assimilate and to not stand out. Don't say things that are controversial or don't say things that might put people off. Because for so long, being seen as ordinary or being seen as one of the group is a safety mechanism.
Yes.
That's how we survive. So I think there was a period, especially when I took on the role as Multicultural Youth Commissioner, this was a place where I was speaking at a lot of events and I adored it. I think it's one of my favorite roles I've had, in my life thus far. But I remember there was a multi-faith conference that I was going to speak at, and I was speaking from the experience of not having a like designated faith. Like I've been to Catholic primary schools, I've been to Christian high schools, I've been raised in a Hindu household. But myself, I think my faith is a lot broader of, not prescribing to one thing, but more having general faith, I guess. But
Hmm.
sitting on an interfaith panel where there are other people who have quite strong relationships with their faith background, it's probably a bit of a different perspective to come from this idea of being quite secular. And I remember this conversation with mum where she was like, "Are you sure you want to do this? Like,
Mhm.
are you sure it would be easier to just say that you're Hindu and just, go about it in that way?" And I was sort of like, no, 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 I think it's important that we talk about, being at the cross section because there's a lot of people I've met who are at a similar place. So I
Mhm.
think from a leadership journey, my family has been my number one support. Now they support me in absolutely everything. They always had. It was just this kind of discomfort with being seen as different or
Yeah.
putting yourself out there and this fear of, of course you're worried about what's going to happen to your kids. If they say something or if it's taken the wrong way or if, visibility means a higher likelihood of being targeted or
Mhm.
being torn down. And we have such a culture in Australia with this tall poppy syndrome of we don't want people to, get too high or stand out too much because it makes them unrelatable. And, when that happens, it's all over. So I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of that background. But for myself in leadership, it really became around representation and how do we make sure that I can wedge the door a little bit open, then the next person after me can wedge it open a little more and a little more, and eventually it's quite normalized. And I think I see that now. Like I do see a lot more young women of color, particularly in leadership. I see a lot more cultural diversity in regional areas, which is so heartwarming, I think, for me to see. Not saying that I had a bad upbringing by any means, more that I could never imagine the upbringing that some of these kids are having now, where all of these concepts around inclusion and diversity are really welcomed and they're named. I think before it was under this banner of unity and multiculturalism. Now
Harmony.
being Harmony Day, classic. Now it's under this banner of like, hey, let's talk about equity and equality. We're all different, and that's great. Not we're all the same, and we need to focus on only the things that make us the same and
Mhm.
sort of betray or hide away these parts that make us different. I think it's quite a different approach now, which is great.
There's been such a huge shift for sure. And I was reading a post that you shared about, I
Mm.
think it would be 3 years ago, when you
Wow,
shared.
you went right back through the archives.
I was in there. I was in there.
Research.
And the opening sentence just got me. And first of all, it was the picture of little Keishi,
Oh,
beautiful, dressed up. You can tell she was like in the middle of a dance or something, just
they're
beautiful.
holding two wooden spoons like this.
Mhm.
I
It
think
was
I know the one.
it just made me happy to see you in
Oh.
that, that version of you. And then it was the opening sentence that then got me because it was really the opposite of the
Mm.
photo. And it said, and I quote, "The color of your skin makes me want to vomit." And it it just stopped me. And I was like, I have to read the rest of this story. And so take me back to that moment in time when little Keishi experienced what I think was racism for the first time.
Mm. Yeah, happy to. I think I find that often for a lot of my stories, and I do believe in this larger concept of you know, we're consistently learning and unlearning what has happened to us, what is happening to us, and what will happen to us, right? So I think that for some of these stories that I share on LinkedIn, the reason I share them is because I want people to gain awareness. And I see myself as, I guess, an educator in some of the experiences I've had of if someone can read this and relate to this, my
Mhm.
job's kind of done. And, the experience wasn't in vain, but it might prevent something similar from happening, right? So I think with that one, that's one of those experiences where at the time, it actually didn't impact me that much because
Mhm.
I was really small. Like I think in the context of this story, I think I was about year two or year three. Like I was real little.
Yeah.
It's only through looking back and getting more involved in multiculturalism and diversity, equity, inclusion that you sort of remember some of these experiences and you're like, oh, that happened. Here's what happened. That wasn't great. And here's how it's shaped me in a way that I probably didn't realize at the time.
Yeah.
And I think that, that moment was one of them. So to give you some context of what happened, and for the listeners at home who may not have seen the post,
Mhm.
um, I was probably in year, I think, two or three. So I was quite young at the time, maybe like five or six. We were playing outside in primary school, pretty hot day. We walked back into the classroom and I decided to sit at a different table to usual because, year three gets real boring. You got to mix it up sometimes. So I went and sat at, I think, the front of the class. And in sitting at this table, there were these two boys who, like, I mean, they were nice. Like, I didn't know too much about them. One of them randomly turned to me and said, "The color of your skin makes you want to vomit." And the other one sort of did this and, put his hand up to his mouth and made some like vomiting, retching noises. And all I remember thinking at the time was like, oh my God, this is terrible. Like, I've clearly made these people feel so unwell, and so terrible that they feel they need to say this. I feel awful. And I was panicking, right? And luckily enough, there was our teacher who was close by, and she was like, "Oh, this is absolutely not on. You need to go to the principal," right? And we had no conversation around what had happened. So we're walking across this like hot Australian asphalt to the principal's office. They're crying, I'm crying. It's a bit of a mess of what's going on. And, we go there, we go home, and sort of the situation's resolved for that day. So I don't know if anyone remembers this, but those art sets that you used to get for Christmas, the ones that have like a little button and you open it and there's like textures and paints, and
Yes.
I've gotten one of those. And I decided that, I need to make these kids a card to say that I'm sorry. So I drew this like red fire engine thing. Mum tells this story better than I do because she remembers it more. But I drew this fire engine card and I put in there saying, "I'm sorry for making you feel unwell." And I took it to school the next day and I gave it to these boys. And the teacher found out and was like, "Okay, someone needs to talk to this child. She clearly does not understand what happened." Called my parents, we had a conversation, the things at bay. But I think what's interesting about that is like for those kids who did that, we knew their parents. Their parents are lovely. So like where they got this rhetoric from, we don't know, right? But I
Mm,
think that was my first brush with like understanding that I was different to other people. Because I think I'd always understood to an extent that I was different, but it was never as different as someone has glasses and I don't. Like it was kind of in that category of like obvious difference. It wasn't
yeah.
a racial difference, right? Like obviously I was young. And while we know that race is a social construct and it is made up to an extent, it
Mm,
does have real world impact. And these are some of those impacts. And I was lucky in that I don't think that really shaped my self-esteem. It didn't cause me to get quieter or whatever. It was just one of those things being like, oh, what a random thing that happened. And then I sort of carried about my day, which I
And
think is great.
and the act of going home and thinking, oh, I made this little boys
Yeah.
unwell. I better just, make something for them. Oh, that bit is what just got me. And I was like, oh my goodness. But I'm so glad to hear that this is not something that, had such a profound
Mm,
shift in your life that it changed you to be, a certain way in order to make certain people feel more comfortable. And I wonder what conversations then followed in the homes of those boys who said these
yeah.
things and where they are today and how they look at matters to do with, race.
Mm.
And when it comes to matters to do with race, why is it that it is such an uncomfortable conversation for I think for all of us. I don't want to just say for white people. It's for all of us. It's so
Everyone.
uncomfortable. But when it comes to white people, that they would rather associate with something else, like, oh, let's talk about gender or other things. Like I'm happy to share my values when it comes to that. But with race, it's like, ooh, that one. I'm just kind of gonna be silent on that or kind of sit on the fence. What do you how do you describe that, or what do you think the reason is behind that kind of thinking?
Yeah, I think, oh, it's such a hard question. I've thought about this a lot because I'll often, in the diversity, equity, inclusion space, we talk about a lot of differences that people have, whether it is age, whether it is ability, whether it is race,
Mm,
so many other things. Like, but I do find that there is this general hesitation to talk about race,
yeah.
which I think is quite difficult. I often think that it's kind of like a system update where we just need to do a system update on society around some of the values that I think we've held and treasured for so long, and how now that our understanding of race and understanding of identity has shifted,
Mm,
it's not compatible with some of those values. And that's where these sort of cogs are whirring together and not really working. So when we think about some of the values that we're raised with around like treat everyone how you want to be treated, treat everybody the same, we need to all get along. Like these
Yeah.
values that are really beautiful and that we learn from a really young age. I think when you bring in this idea of equity and that people are different,
Hmm.
it kind of messes with those values. So when we look at treat everyone the same, all of a sudden we're saying, no, 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 don't treat everyone the same because they're not the same. We need to treat people differently. And that feels like, oh, no, 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 that doesn't work. That's not what I know. Or if we look at something like, you need to treat people how you want to be treated,
Yes.
how you want to be treated is kind of immaterial sometimes because you don't have the same experience or the same identity as this other person. So I do think that we're at a values crisis in some ways of we've been taught one thing, but now things have moved on and there's something that's not quite crunching together. And I
Mm.
do think also there's this this value of not making a fuss or like, try and don't get into anything like complex, don't make it a big thing. So where we do disagree, we tend to move away from topics where there is disagreement or, race feels uncomfortable, so don't talk about it. Like that willingness to sit in conflict or sit in discomfort is really difficult to grapple with as well. And
Yeah.
especially because, there's so many people who can't relate to the idea of race. Like I'll often talk about it around like, it's a silly example, but if you ask a fish what water is, they'll be like, I don't know. What do you mean? And it's because they live in it, right? Like this is a system that we live in. And we're not actually
Mm.
trained to look at the system itself. We're just trained to operate within the systems.
I love that.
So race is one of those constructs.
That is such a good analogy. And there's also that, as you were saying, the information is can be a little bit misleading.
Hmm.
Don't see color. We're all the
Yeah,
same.
be
And then
colorblind.
see
Yeah.
color, you need
Yeah,
to
yeah.
see me, and I am different. Okay, I see you, but we're not supposed to treat you differently because of your color. So it becomes very mixed messaging. And I think for us as educators or for us as people of color, we know it for what it is. We know race for what it is, and it's not something that we are uh, shy away from. It's a lived experience. We experience it every day of our lives, being different, particularly in predominantly occupying spaces where you are the only one. We've learned to deal with that. But for the others, like the fish in water, what are you talking about? This is all I know it to be. It is a very different way. And so how do we meet people where they're at? And,
Mm.
one of the things I love when I landed on your website was if you're curious about diversity, equity, and inclusion, you're in the right place. So, how do we begin to have these conversations? Or, if it's sparking a little bit of curiosity, where do we begin, particularly in the workplace where things to do with race, and in Australia in particular, it's still so taboo. It's not something that
Yeah.
we can just talk about. You have to be so careful the kind of language that you use so that you don't lose people, that you bring them along on the journey, that you make it such that it's something that they can digest and take it in and invite you to come back again and potentially go through the whole training series or the whole workshop. How do we begin to have these conversations?
Mm. I think it's something that I've spent, my lifetime so far trying to work out, which is how do you have these conversations or how do you tell people that something they've believed for so long might not be right? Right. And I think that a lot of these conversations and, my background looking at DEI, but also my background in conflict resolution and how do you get two people who are diametrically opposed to meet in the middle. A
Yeah.
lot of these theories and this love of education sort of comes through that lens as well. So I do think there's a really big piece of work for any educator to do in thinking about how we empathize with our learner. And that feels really yucky because if you're in the activism space, we're used to a lot of these things of like, it's not my job to educate you. That's your job to do that. Or like, people need to know better. They need to take accountability.
Yeah.
They need to do the work themselves. Like, I'm not a library for you to use my emotional labor.
Mhm.
All of these things are true, right? And one of the things I hold really dear to my heart in terms of value is that two things can be true at the same time. So
Yes.
this can be
Yes.
true, right? But we also know if we want to see change, we need to meet people where they are. we need to be patient, and sometimes we do need to educate because I can tell someone to go read a book and they're not gonna. Like, so how do we use these moments? And I think for a really long time, I felt really conflicted in that because
Mm, mm,
coming from someone who's been on the community line and front lines in some spaces, moving into the corporate space or moving into the education space predominantly for institutions and big structures, people are often like, Khayshie, you're selling out. Like, what, why are you all of a sudden, doing these education pieces and you're no longer in the advocacy sort of side of things? And I think for myself, I was like, oh no, am I selling out to do this work? But in the end, I realized that, there's a role for every person on the advocacy spectrum, right? So there's people who sit in the activist spectrum. They're the ones who are very like out loud, super proud, sometimes like unforgiving, but like power to them. They call people out. They're really vocal. Then there's people in, the advocacy space who are much more like the comparison I give is like we both hate the system. One of us wants to burn it down, and the other one is trying to work within it.
mm,
So like it's both things are needed and we can flex between what role we play. Like it's not like one person's an activist and one person's an advocate. But sometimes you need to sit in this advocacy space of like, yeah, this system's not great. I don't love it, but I know how to play within this game in order to break the game and make it more accessible. But if we just stay on the outside,
mm,
just keep sort of trying to influence from the outside in, sometimes that doesn't work. You need this sort of pincer move that takes them from both sides. So when I look at education, I do think of it, in that way of, okay, what does this person need to see, think, hear, believe in order to get them to where I need them to be? And I do think that DEI is often seen as this big fluffy thing, like, or anti-racism. They're kind of like, oh, we're going to solve this through everyone coming together and, having a big conversation about it. And then everyone's going to feel good. And then we're going to move to the next day of significance. Like it's at this sort of tokenistic level. But I often say that, DEI is not too dissimilar from change management of anything. Like if budgets were all
mm,
of a sudden terrible, you wouldn't sit around and hold hands and have a conversation and how budgets need to change and then be like, all right, we'll talk about that next money day and do nothing about it. You need to apply change management principles, right? And how do we educate in the framework of change management? So there's a principle I learned from a course I did a way back on change management, which said that it was like such a mic drop moment from the presenter, where they said the only difference between, a laggard of change and someone who's the front runner is often how long they've known about the change. So, say if management has been sitting with a restructure for a really long time, and they're like, restructure, restructure, talk about it. Then they tell the employees, and all the employees kick off, right? Management's going to be like, we explained it as best we could. I don't understand why they don't get it. But they've been sitting with this knowledge of the restructure for like 6 months to a year, right? But the employees have only just found out about it. And while that seems like a really rudimentary example, it's the same thing for DEI. So we've lived with this forever. We know about race, or like we know this language. This is our bread and butter as practitioners, is to
yes.
know these concepts. It's so obvious. But for some people in the room, this is the first they've ever heard of it, or the
Mm,
first they've ever engaged with it. And I do think there is merit in giving people grace in that, because I do think about this concept of like within learning theories, they talk about like the zone of comfort or like the zone of discomfort. So the aim is how do we get to a place where people are challenged, but they're not overwhelmed? So they're challenged enough to pay attention and not be like, I know all this stuff, this is really basic, but they're not overwhelmed by like, oh my God, everything's terrible and I'm a terrible person, at that stage. So how do we, I guess, mindfully operate as practitioners to sit in there? And I also think that everyone has a bandwidth for change. So if you look at feedback, for example, like if your boss says to you, like, hey, Annie, I have some feedback for you. You need to improve in this area. You'd be like, yeah, thanks, boss. That sounds good. But if all of a sudden I'm like, you've been writing reports wrong your entire life,
mm.
and everyone has been harmed by the way that you've been writing reports. And here's all the things that you need to be doing to change, and you need to do better, and you need to take accountability and all that. You might be like, holy crap, what do I do with this now? I'm a terrible person, and this zone of overwhelm. So I think it is difficult because there's a place where DEI practitioners needs to oscillate between holding people accountable and not letting people sort of be like, oh, that's not my problem, but also not pushing them into this state of overwhelm
Mhm.
We've sat with this for a really long time, but they might be learning something new. I feel like it's a very it's a very difficult sort of place to land, I guess. But
And this is what makes or breaks a good educator, you know. This is where you've got to know your audience. You've got to know
for
the
sure.
people that you are presenting to. You've got to know what their needs are. You've also got to know where they are on their journey.
Yeah,
And for a lot of people, they're at the beginning. For a lot of people, they don't even see what the issue is in the way that we see the issue being. And
yeah,
so it takes an art, a balance, and really just being informed about them in order to bring them on the journey. You cannot just take a particular, I love how you defined activism and advocacy.
mm,
Gosh, that was so beautiful because sometimes we just take on activism and we bring that into our work
mm,
and the message is just not hitting home, or you are just, people are feeling so overwhelmed. They don't know where to begin. It's too hard. They are fearful, and fear just gets in the way. And
yeah.
so no progress is made. Um,
It's difficult too, because I do think of like I've there was a course that a university was doing, which was they're creating a course in communications and advocacy for the first time. So I was giving them a bit of a guest sort of spot on what I think about that. And I gave them this model where I'm like, you need to do your homework on the people you're talking to
yes.
because they often fall into like one of three categories or a combination. And one of them is head, one of them is heart, and one of them is hands. So some people need to hear the stats, they need the head stuff. So like give
Mm,
me facts and figures and numbers and tell me how DEI is good for my organization from our bottom
yeah.
line and blah, blah, blah. Some people are heart. They're like, tell me the stories, tell me the emotions, the feelings. Like, I want to feel something. Absolutely. And then I'll make the change and I'll move. And other people are hands. They're like, Khayshie, I get it. Stuff's bad. We got to change. Yeah, yeah, yeah. What do I need to do? I just
Mhm.
want to know like the practical actions. So I've been in rooms before with, say, C-suite, where you have some people who are like really stat-brained, like they need the stats. Some people are super heart-led. Some people need action, and you need to find a combination of both. But what you can't do is go to someone who's really like in their head about it and they need to know the data and then be like, here's a story about how I was growing up or what happened. And there's power
Yeah.
in that qualitative data because they can't argue with it since it's your
Hmm.
experience,
Hmm.
but it might not be hitting what they need. So there is this assessment of like, how do we look at people, understand what they need to move? And then, of course, there's like little things around like, my hot tips are like, make sure that you explain to people that you're not going to solve 30 years of socialization
Yes.
in an hour. Like, set expectations that, you're not to be blamed. Don't sit in a place of shame for too long around a system that you might have been perpetuating that you didn't know. And
Mm.
also, like, take responsibility for it, but don't sit there because all of us have had to learn or unlearn a system at some point in our life,
Yeah.
continual. And then that gets people past this block of, oh my God, Annie's telling me I'm a terrible person, or Casey's telling me I'm a terrible person. What do I do now?
Mm.
It just gives them that grace to be like, we are all imperfect people in an imperfect world. These systems were not often built by you, and the people who built them, like any system we build in our own image. So
Mm.
if they didn't experience some of these blocks that someone else is experiencing, they might have built a system that doesn't account for them. Some people in history did that purposely. Other people were just operating from the only frame of reference they knew, which is their own. And
Yeah.
now we have this responsibility to identify it and potentially deconstruct some of those systems.
Mm. I feel like it's really about taking people on a journey because
100%.
as you've defined, the head, the heart, the hands, I feel like it's such a combination, as you've said.
Mm.
And because I think people hear the stories and a lot of them get so heartbroken, they're crying, there's
Yeah,
guilt, there's like, oh my goodness, this is
so many
hard.
emotions.
And then they're like, okay, tell me what to do, tell me what to do. And the tell me what to do, sometimes in my experience, what I've seen, it's like, I don't want to hear about it anymore. Just tell
Yeah.
me what to do to make it
How do I
better.
get out of this? Yeah.
Yeah, to make it better. What can we do? How do we fix this? And
Yeah.
obviously, we cannot fix this lifetime of an issue. Um, it takes time. And I feel like sometimes those actions do this. Sometimes you need to sit
Mm,
that head data that has been shared. You need to sit in the heart of the matter in terms of those stories before we can move forward into the action, because the action will mean nothing if you yourself haven't done the work of feeling, of experience, and taking the steps to do better. Because a lot of times they tell me what to do is so that I can correct what others are doing wrong.
100%.
You
But
know?
also, it doesn't create any sustainability. Like, and I think this is where a lot of the times we go wrong is we teach people rote facts. We don't teach them how to think. So I often say, like, if we can teach people the mindset, like our actions spring from our thoughts, it springs from what we think. If we can impact people at that level, the actions will spit out in a way that is in line. But if we only tell people like, do say this, don't say this, do this, don't do that, they're not going to actually learn how to build that muscle of inclusive thinking or like what are those mindsets we need to think and act inclusively. They'll
Mm.
just be like, okay, I'm going to go through this checklist that Kayshie gave me and I'm going to tick it all off. And then that's my DEI done, you know?
And you kind of feel good. I'm a good person because
Absolutely.
we all want to feel good, right? We all want to feel like we are good people. And so what am I doing? Let me look at this checklist. Oh, okay, I'm that, I'm that, I'm that. Maybe I need to work a little bit on this. Like you're gauging yourself. And a lot of this is more through life, how you're living it. The values are part of your who you are as human being. It's not a to-do list. It's more of something that you embody when it comes to inclusive practices.
Yeah.
And as you're talking about C-suite, I'm wondering what are the things that leaders are getting wrong about DEI? Because when you look back 5 years ago, the murder of George Floyd brought so much awareness globally, not just in the United States, but globally. But as the years have gone by, the interest has sort of, died down. Roles that had been put out for, DEI positions in organizations have just been kind of moved along, no longer needed. We can now operate independently of these roles. What do you think leaders are getting wrong about DEI?
Yeah. Great question, especially in, today's political climate.
Yes.
I do think that we're very reactive in the way that we do things, right? So a lot of like George Floyd's murder happened, BLM started, and we're so quick to exactly what we talked about, I guess, just before around we want to do something so
Yeah.
that we don't feel guilty. Not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily doing the right thing, it's doing something, right? And I think that was a really trying time for people in DEI because at that point you want to capitalize on organizations who have this goodwill all of a sudden. And you're like, cool, here's what you need to do. But then you had organizations who stopped there and said, cool, I've ticked it off. I don't need to do anything else.
Yeah.
And there's such danger, I think, in rote application of processes. Like we do
Mhm.
this copy and paste exercise between organizations of like, oh, this big organization published their DEI action plan. It had all of these actions. I'm just going to copy paste that into my organization and
Right.
it's going to work. Whereas I often say to people, like, DEI is a bit of a science because it's not a set framework. Like, there are frameworks that people have developed through
Yeah.
research, which is brilliant.
Yeah.
But this is about understanding what specific problems you have in your organization,
Mm.
what the tension points are, and then trialing a solution and you pilot it. If it works, you extend it. If it doesn't, you go back to the drawing board and you try something else.
That's right.
But we're so used to being like, I'm going to fix all our problems because we're going to create an employee resource group or we're
Mm.
going to do all these things. And sometimes, employee resource groups can be fantastically useful, but they also rely on a lot of volunteers. If you're not paying them, like I
Mm.
know big organizations who have won awards for their DEI efforts, and it's completely off the back of their volunteer employee resource group where I'm like, isn't it weird that we're getting the very people who are marginalized to do the work, to unmarginalize ourselves, and then the organization gets the award? Like it's a bit weird, right? Like if you're paying them and they're being recognized, and that's a different story, and they want to do it. But I think we just copy paste this solution, and sometimes we don't take a minute to be like, are we still going along that same path that we set out to go on, or are we just sort of copying and pasting things across?
That is so powerful. Let's just pause there for a moment. We're getting the marginalized people to unmarginalize themselves, and they're not getting compensated for that because this is a voluntary role. Oof, let's just sit with that because
Yeah,
when I think of leadership in corporate organizations and they're looking at issues to do with specifically race issues, it's like, oh, we're so inclusive or we're so diverse. Look at our statistics. Look at the number of people who work here who come from different backgrounds. It's the United Nations here, so to
yeah,
speak. But how do those people, have you had conversations with them? How are they coping at work? How are they showing up? What are they bringing to, a lot of people of color are showing up. They are afraid. They do not speak up. They're just towing the line because this is their job. They don't want to lose their job. They have bills to pay. And so people are showing up and they're being quiet. And the silence is their survival. So you might be saying, we're so inclusive, we're so diverse, look at us. But what if you were to have really open, candid conversations? What would those people say about their experience of working in that organization?
100%. And often, like I'll say, like especially in, with Australia, moving more into the positive duty space around sexual harassment, for example, I'll
Yeah.
often say that the more included or the more safe people feel, the higher your complaints will be, because that should translate into people trusting a system and using the system. Because as you said earlier, like we can't solve the world's problems
Mhm.
in a day, but we can create mechanisms and channels for accountability. And how do we look at it? So I often find it interesting when people say, oh, we haven't received a single complaint in DEI, and I'm like, okay, how are you gathering the complaints and who's asking? What protections are there for these people?
Yes.
Complaints aren't a bad thing. Like they feel bad, but they're not a bad thing. Like it's telling you where you need to focus.
That's
I
right.
get much more afraid if there's no data. Because I'm
Mhm.
like, well, people don't feel safe enough to tell you the data nine times
Right.
out of 10. Like I'm yet to find an organization where everyone I've spoken to feels 100% included, represented, safe, and that's why they have zero complaints. It's usually I don't want people to find out that I complained. I don't want this to come back on me. That's a huge piece. Also,
Mm.
like, going back to this idea of, the marginalized doing the work, like it is people who feel grateful. Like they're stuck in this idea of, well, I'm supposed to feel grateful because I got a leadership opportunity to speak at Harmony Day. But then I ended up talking about my experiences of racism, and now people talk to me differently in the office. But I should feel grateful because they put me in the newsletter. Or like,
Mhm.
feel grateful because it was an opportunity for me to develop speaking. And it's very different depending on the person, because what can empower somebody can disempower another, which is why we need to be curious, because some people might feel it really empowering to get up on stage and talk about what they've gone through. Other people, that's like a recurring nightmare that they wake up from, every now and then. So you need to be really curious. And this is why I often say, the curious about DEI, come talk to me, because this curiosity, I think, is the core value we need to keep, which is
Mhm.
not getting too comfortable that what we're doing is working for everyone, because everyone's different.
That is so powerful. Not getting comfortable in what we're doing is working. It doesn't work for everyone. We're not all the same. And to the person who we're in the workplace and they have been signed up to go and do a DI workshop or training, and you can see them and you're like, oh, what brought you here? Oh, my manager signed me up, or I was told to come here. How do you get such a person to be a little bit more open to the experience and what the lessons lie ahead for them? Because I think sometimes it's seen as just this thing that we tick a box so that we can say, "Oh, I did that workshop. I'm a safe person," or I know what it means to be inclusive. I've ticked that. It's as part of my professional development. But how do we get the people who come in to know that it is so much more than just something that you're ticking for the office?
Yeah, I think it really does go back to this head, heart, hands thing of like, what do some people need to hear? So you would have seen on a recent LinkedIn post, I talk about this like pretty harrowing statistic that was done by the UKG Institute. So they did this survey, I think it was like over 3,000 people across 10 countries. They were talking about workplace well-being.
Mm.
And they found this statistic, which terrifies me, that says for nearly 70% of people, their manager has more of an impact on their mental health than their therapist, than their doctor, and just as much as their spouse. And there's like so many stats. I think there was something like, 40% of people said that they are often or always stressed at work, which is terrifying. Or 60% of employees say that their workplace or their job has the biggest impact on their mental health over any other factor. So sometimes I'll sit in a room with these leaders and I'll give them some of these statistics and I'll ask them how they feel about it. And I find that in a management perspective, like I'll often throw these stats out and say, how comfortable do you now feel about the way that you've been managing? And there's this immediate sense of like, oh no, like we have more of an impact than what we know. And I think this is the real impact of disempowerment. Like I find that middle management is where people have power, but they feel expressly disempowered. And
Mm.
it's really interesting how that shows up in the workplace because they don't feel like they have enough of an influence to make a difference in an employee's life.
Yeah,
They do, but they also have power. So it's up to that sort of group sometimes to have this sort of realization and come to it moment of like, I actually impact someone's workday massively. And how do I show up for that? And I'll often give this analogy, and you've probably guessed I do love an analogy, but I give this analogy around like, if you go to Bunnings and you buy like some seeds and you plant them in the ground and they don't flower, we're very rare to be like, you're a bad seed, terrible seed. We're usually like, did we water them enough? Is there enough nutrients in the soil?
yeah.
Is it in the sun? Like what did we do wrong? Why is this not growing? Like, we must be doing something to not give it the conditions it needs to thrive. And then maybe if you've done all those things, you can go back to Bunnings and with your receipt and be like, give me some seeds that are not dodgy. But in the workplace, we never do that. We're like, this is this person's fault for being unmotivated. We
Yeah.
rarely look internally as leaders and say, did we give this person the right environment to do their best work? What did we do?
Mm.
And when we start looking at the role of leadership is to sort of support others and get rid of barriers for them, that's when we can get to a place where your team will thrive and your organization will thrive. But so often we sit in this other space of blaming the seed. And I think when I talk to managers about it, they often have this weird aha moment where they're like, oh yeah, like that would be really weird for me to be like, that's a terrible seed before looking at my own gardening ability. But that's what managers need to be doing is really assessing how do I take responsibility for this statistic? Like, what am I doing to support someone in their workplace? And that also ripples into everything. Like, I'll often talk about how the workplace is this really, it's our best chance at societal change. Because what
Absolutely.
we learn in the workplace and how we learn to act in the workplace impacts how people show up at home and it impacts how they show up in the community. And that transforms society. So, like, when people come to me and be like, why do you work with corporates now? I'm often like, because the things that I was trying to solve with the community line can be addressed in the corporate workplace. That's this huge thing. Like, a workplace is a microcosm of society. If
Yeah.
we can look at influencing behavior here, we change how people think. And then if we get leaders to invest in that sort of training around these topics like diversity, equity, inclusion, intersectionality, gender equality, if we can learn that at the workplace, they'll take that into how they talk to their partner, how they talk to their kids. They take that into how they coach a soccer team. They take that into how they talk to their friends. And that's how we actually get to this place of change. But right now, I think there's a lot of workplaces who view the people in their workplace as workers. So they're like, Khayshie, I don't understand how this relates to my workplace or how this improves them as workers. And I'll be like, okay, I can come up with a million arguments for that, but pause a moment. And I'll say to them, okay, you're telling me that gender equality might not be important to teach at the workplace. What if I now tell you that this employee of yours is going to coach the soccer team of your child? Now are you invested in teaching gender equality? Like, what if they're teaching your daughter and they don't believe that she can, play soccer as well as the other kids
Mhm.
because she's a woman or whatever it is? What if he's teaching your son? and he's saying to your son, like, he's modeling these really toxic behaviors of yelling and getting really angry, and he's telling your son, like, stop crying, you need to be better at this, like, pull your head in.
Yeah.
Do you think then it's important to talk about gender equality? And
Mm,
you'll often see this shift where people realize that the people in their workplace are the same people in their communities and the same people in society. So if we actually look at the workplace as this huge opportunity for us, in the same way that we target schools for kids, where we say, change needs to happen at school because it's where most of them spend their time. I think there's some crazy stat, like we spend like 90,000 hours at work, or like it might be even bigger. So when we think about those hours and the potential for change, it's actually huge. But we'll often like play in different corners. Like we'll have community impact in one space and workplace impact in another. Where for me, I'm like, if you want to get people who are primed to take action in their community and make change, the workplace is a fantastic place to actually start a lot of that education.
yes, there's so many skills that are so transferable when we begin to look at it
Yeah.
not from one lens, but the way in which it just trickles and has an impact in every area of your life. And you have articulated that so beautifully.
Oh,
Now,
thank
Kate, now, Kate, as we're bringing this to a close, there's a quote that you had written an article, and this quote was so powerful because it was from a conversation that you had with a lady. You were in New York and you had gone for the CWS, and Helen Dally Fisher, I
Oh,
think her name.
she's incredible.
And she said something about, you were feeling very dejected. Progress is not being made. You've gone there to have conversations and potentially move the needle forward as it pertains to gender equality, gender equity, but nothing was moving. Everything was just kind of being watered down. And she said something around creating the floor and not raising the ceiling. And it was such an aha moment when I read that, because as we do this work of DEI, it's often like we're not doing enough, not enough is happening, not enough inclusive language, not enough is being helping us move forward.
Mm,
I just love this analogy. And even when it comes to like International Women's Day, and we're like, oh, we're still so far away, but
yeah.
if we just take a moment to look at how far we've come, and this was one of your takeaways that you said, and I quote, but it's just as important to take the time to look at the floor beneath us and consider how we can preserve it to ensure we don't regress and that we have a consistent flow globally. That just took me out.
I'm so glad you enjoyed it. It was definitely like a big learning. And, for those of you listening, CSW is this big forum that happens at the United Nations every year. So it stands for Commission on the Status of Women. And it is the one time, which is 2 weeks in the year, that the UN comes together to talk about gender equality. So there was this big document. This is the Cliff Notes version of this conference, but there's a big document that was called the Beijing Declaration, which was about what multiple countries are agreeing to when it comes to gender equality. And then every year there's a theme of like gender equality and tech, or like gender equality and poverty, where we'll discuss a theme every year and see how are we stacking up to what we agreed to 30 years ago. And this year was actually, I think, the 30-year, review of that document because it's been that long.
Wow.
So in going along to this, I'm really fortunate to have gone twice now. So the first time I went was more as a civil society spectator, so hanging on the outside. The second time I was lucky enough to be on the government delegation, so in the negotiation room and listening to countries. And that was, I can do a whole other podcast on that. That was a time to see, how these countries argue. But I think in going for the first time, I was like, yeah, we're going to a UN conference on women's rights. We're going to like push things forward. I was like so wide-eyed and like idealistic.
Yes.
The way this works is that the point of this conference is that you create this thing at the end called the agreed conclusions, which is a laundry list of what all of the countries are going to agree to going forward about this topic, right? The tricky part is that this is a document by consensus. So every country has to agree. And you can imagine there are some countries who probably don't want gender equality to progress as much. So it is this global group assignment in writing a document that reflects what some countries want to do and others want to do all together in the one, right? So you can imagine me going in as a very bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, like, we're going to make change in gender equality, and then realizing that this document needs to include really, really conservative views of some countries
Yeah.
and really progressive views of other countries. And if someone's not happy with the document, they can just fold their arms and be like, I don't want to. They don't even have to give a reason. This is what I've learned in the negotiating room. They can just be like, Madam Speaker, I'm really uncomfortable with this language. I don't like it. And then you have to change it. If not, it gets taken out. So
Wow.
it's this massive, massive, massive group assignment. So the UN puts out this document, then all of the countries take the document and do this big track changes thing. And then one poor country has to compile all of those track changes into one document. That goes out again. People disagree. They're like, I wanted an and there. I wanted a comma here, blah, blah, blah. And then it all comes together. And then all of these countries sit in a room with like Google Docs on the screen and they go line by line and they talk about, each issue and to the extent of I agree or I don't agree with it. So I think when I was going in there, I thought that it was this really progressive exercise. And we're going to talk about how do we push women's rights. But what I realized when I got there was that there was actually so much resistance and there was so much backlash because you had countries who really disagree. And the thing about this, and it kind of tickles the brain a little bit because my background in legal was in statutory interpretation. So the law of understanding the law. What do certain words mean? So in this sort of venue, words are currency. So you're trading words around. So if you say women and girls, that seems like a really normal phrase. But if you say women, you're expressly taking out girls. So this right only applies to women and not girls, right? If we say family values, we're talking about the nuclear family. We're talking about mum, dad, kids. That's it, nothing else. If we're talking about, sexual and reproductive health, that's a really specific definition. Versus if we talk about, if we're talking about the rights of the parent, we're talking about parents' rights over kids, i.e., girls don't have rights. So there's really specific language that you need to look out for of like, where is this language sort of seeping in? But keeping in mind that we all need to get along and we all need to agree at the end, you do need to make trade-offs. So you
Mm.
see that where you had a win in some years of having women and girls, women and girls, women and girls, in a successive year, it might just be women. And you had to trade the and girls to get something in elsewhere. So I think I was really frustrated, and these negotiations went on till like 3, 4 in the morning, like every
Yeah.
night for the 2 weeks.
Yeah.
I was so tired and I was so angry. And I was sitting there and Helen is someone who's been in this forum for the last like 10 years. Like she's such an incredible person in the way that she sort of organizes everyone and really wraps her arms around the Australian sort of civil society group. And I was saying to her, I was like, what is the point? Like, we're coming here, and sentences like, say, for example, every country needs to create a national plan to end violence against women, will turn into countries may take action to
Yeah.
support, like, it'll turn into this like vague, diluted thing. So I was really frustrated and a bit naive. And I was like, Helen, what's the point of this? Like, I was like, I don't understand why we're doing this. Like, we're better off just not coming. Like, what is the point of having an agreement if the agreement's going to be so diluted that we never make progress? And I knew that she kind of looked at me with this like knowing glint in her eye, being like, I know exactly what you feel because I've been through this feeling. And she explained this whole thing of like, Keishi, while making progress is really important, it's just as important that we don't regress. And if we don't turn up, there's no one to actually argue against
Yes.
progression of a lot of these things. So it feels pointless and it feels hard and like we're not making progress. But so long as the floor isn't slipping and we're not losing ground, that's actually a really positive outcome. And I was like, but then what's the point if we just do that every year? And then she sort of explained very lovingly that, the more that we come here and we say these things year after year after year, all we can do is hope that one year the tide will change. Like one year, they've heard it so much that it's a little bit more normalized than the previous year, and finally the tide turns. But
Mhm.
that hope is really important for activism and for advocacy, because if we lose that, then the whole thing's going to fall apart. So sometimes it is more important and super important in so many spaces to look at the floor that we're holding and recognize that even keeping people there is just as important as sort of like pushing them forward. And I think the best thing was when I went the second year, I was talking, there was a really fantastic group called Global Voices who send like young policy scholars every year. So, like, usually a young group of women to come in, sort of observe CSW. And I had this great moment last year where, we were all sitting down after a debrief and they looked quite dejected. And I was like, what's going on? And they're like, what is the point of this forum? I'm here to observe policy solutions, and everyone's just talking and nothing's happening. And, they're not making progress. And what's the point if things are diluted? And I got to have that moment of the glint in my eye being like, let me tell you about how important it is to hold the floor and
Mhm.
sort of pass on
Wow.
this advice, being like, this is what we're here for, is, every year we have to come here hoping that, every time we hit against this wall, one day it's going to fall over. But if we never hit it again, it's never going to. So that's that hope that we need to keep alive.
And I think it's such an important message to all of us as we do this work of inclusion, of equity. We just need to stay consistent because at some point, there will be progress. And it's all about the turning up, the showing up, because if we don't show up, and that is through talking about this, through educating ourselves, through being more aware, we can't just sit on the sidelines. When we begin to take action, with time, something will happen. There will be change, there will be progress. And I was, thinking about how you mentioned growing up in a regional town, Bendigo, not having much representation, but then going back home very recently, and I think it was a Easter parade, and just
Yeah.
seeing how much cultural diversity there was, and it felt like a full circle moment, and so that just to tie in with this whole, just keep showing up, something's going to change. And I think that's a beautiful place for us to bring this conversation to a close. Keishi, there's a question that I often ask everyone who comes on this program, on this show, and you probably know it because you've been listening. If fear wasn't a factor, how do you think you would show up in your work?
Mm, great question. I feel like I've listened to your podcast a lot and I did not consider that I'll be asked this question. State of thought. I think for me, it would, we can sit in the D&I space for a really long time and we can name the systems that we're up against, I guess, in terms of like imposter syndrome and, having backlash, having resistance. But being able to intellectualize these things doesn't make it less scary. And I think I definitely feel that sometimes where, I'll try and write things in a way that takes into account everybody's point of view, or I'll try and, almost de-risk a lot of the things that I put out there or what I say, or I try and give a lot of context and a lot of grace and a lot of caveats to make sure that people truly understand what I mean. And I think, if fear wasn't a factor, I would probably be a bit less precious about doing that. Because I do think that, I have a really fantastic mentor who said to me that, like, Keishi, all your job is to say the message. Then, the baton hands over to someone else who needs to receive it. Whereas for me, I'm like, no, I need to craft it perfectly so they get it. And there's an element of that. You need to make sure that, you relate to your audience and you're saying things appropriately. But
Mhm.
sometimes, you're just not someone's cup of tea, and that's okay. Like, what you say and what you write doesn't need to be for everybody, but it will be for someone. And then the baton passes to them. And, she gave me the most loving and brutal call out that I've ever had in my life, where I wasn't posting on LinkedIn and she kept saying to me, you need to post. And I was like, "Ooh, I feel so cringe and yucky when I do it. I don't know, like it feels a bit self-serving. Eh." And then she was like, Keishi, would you consider yourself a generous person? And I was like, I mean, I hope so. Like, yeah, I guess. And she's like, okay, and do you think that you learn things and, you've got insights that need that you could share and people haven't gone through and they might learn from it? And I was like, yeah. And she's like, so you're telling me that you're letting your fear of looking silly and your ego get in the way of someone learning something? And I was like, oh, maybe. And she's like, doesn't sound very generous of you. And I was like, oh, the most devastating and loving call out I've ever had. And that was a huge turning point for me that I'm still working on, which is how do we, show up in that way? And how do we put our own ego aside and put our own fears aside in order to share something, knowing that, people can have any reception to it that they might have. And, we need to live with that. Two things can be true. You can say something that's true and it might not be relatable or true for someone else. And we need to be able to sit in that difference. And for someone like me who talks about conflict resolution a lot and has practiced in, looking at how do we educate organizations around it and mediation and la la la, it does get easier sometimes to sit in conflict.
Hmm.
But it's only through creating an evidence log that it's possible and we can do it that we will learn. So I feel like I'm still sitting in that space, as we all probably all should, of creating that evidence log that, I can say things or I can put things out that aren't the most polished thing in the world, and the whole thing's not going to come crashing down on me, one day.
Oh, we need more grace. And we need more mentors like that mentor of yours because it sounds so much like something Kemi Nekvapil would say.
Mm.
That sounds like how she would question back certain things that feel unsafe or feel fearful about. Now, if people want to get in touch with you, where is the best place they can get in touch?
Oh, always happy to be in touch, get a coffee, virtual, in person, whatever otherwise. Best place to find me is on LinkedIn. So you'll probably see it linked in the show notes, I'd assume. But
Yes,
I
it
have
is.
a website, which is khayshie.com. So feel free to find me there and yeah, would love to have a chat.
Wonderful. Keishi, thank you so much for your time. You have been so generous. You've shared so much wisdom. This is an episode I want to go back and listen to again. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a review so this podcast can reach more online business owners, and together we can begin to normalize racial inclusion in the online coaching space. I'd love to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where this podcast episode was recorded, the Wiradjuri people in central New South Wales, Australia. Music produced in Nairobi, Kenya by Patrick St. P. Mbaru and Kambua Mathu. Vocals by Joanne Matata.